Sometimes we judge people by what we see on the surface, only to discover we've been looking at everything wrong. In a world where appearances often deceive, one moment can change how we see worth, love, and what truly matters. In the frontier town of Crossbow Ridge, wealthy Virginia Hale thought she knew how to measure a man's value. Only suitors with gold and breeding caught her attention. When her wagon broke down one market day, she mocked a poor drifter named Wes Calder. "Fix my wagon and it's yours," she laughed. The crowd expected him to walk away. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves. In 15 minutes, using just a knife and skilled hands, he fixed what no fancy gentleman could. The wagon rolled smoother than ever. Virginia stared in shock. What happens when someone who values wealth discovers the richest person might be the one without money? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Crossbow Ridge's main street, illuminating dust motes that danced through the air like tiny golden coins. Virginia Hale adjusted the pearl necklace at her throw-out gift from her grandmother that had been passed down through 3 generations of merchant wives and stepped delicately around a puddle that threatened her silk slippers. The weight of the pearls reminded her of who she was, where she belonged, and what was expected of her. At 23, Virginia had turned away more suitors than most women her age had ever met. Not because she was particular about love, she scarcely believed in such romantic nonsense, but because she understood her worth in the carefully measured currency of Crossbow Ridge society. As the only daughter of Edmund Hale, who owned the largest mercantile operation in 3 counties, she represented more than just herself. She was a business proposition, a social alliance, a carefully cultivated asset that would someday merge with another family's fortune to create something even grander. Her father's empire stretched from the lumber mills in the northern mountains to the cattle ranches that dotted the southern valleys. Freight wagons, bearing the Hale name, rumbled through town daily, carrying goods to settlements scattered across the territory. The family's influence touched every aspect of life in Crossbow Ridge, from the bank where Edmund served on the board to the church where the Hale family pew sat prominently in the front row. Virginia had been raised to understand her position with the same precision her father applied to his ledgers. She could calculate the social value of a potential suitor as quickly as she could tally columns of figures. Did he own land? How much? What were his family connections? Did his wealth come from respectable sources, mining, ranching, or trader, from the less savory enterprises that sometimes flourished on the frontier? The young men who called on her fell into predictable categories. There was Marcus Whitman, the banker's son, whose pale hands had never held anything heavier than a pen and whose conversation rarely strayed from interest rates and investment opportunities. Then came Theodore Ashford, heir to a mining fortune, who spoke endlessly of his education back east and his plans to bring proper civilization to their rough territory. Both men possessed the requisite wealth and breeding, but Virginia found their company as stimulating as watching paint dry on barn siding. She had developed a reputation for her sharp tongue, though the townsfolk called it spirited when they were being charitable and difficult when they thought she couldn't hear. Virginia preferred to think of it as practical. Why waste time on pleasantries with men who bored her senseless? If they couldn't handle her honesty, they certainly couldn't handle being married to Edmund Hale's daughter. The truth was, Virginia had armored herself in expectations and social conventions because they provided a comfortable framework for her life. She knew exactly what was expected of her, exactly how to behave, exactly whom to consider worthy of her attention. It was a narrow world, but it was predictable, and predictability meant safety. On this particular morning, as she made her way to oversee the loading of supplies bound for the mining camps, Virginia felt the familiar satisfaction of knowing her place in the world's order. Her emerald dress-imported fabric that cost more than most families spent on clothing in a year rustled softly as she walked. The sound reminded her of her mother, who had died when Virginia was 15, leaving behind a legacy of social grace and the firm belief that a woman's worth was measured by the man she married. The market square buzzed with its usual morning activity. Merchants hawked their wares, children darted between the wagon wheels, and the scent of fresh bread from the bakery mingled with the earthy smell of horses and leather. Virginia nodded graciously to those who greeted her, maintaining the perfect balance of friendliness and distance that her station required. Near the loading dock, where her family's freight wagons waited, a small crowd had gathered. Virginia could see Marcus Whitman's golden hair gleaming in the sunlight as he gestured expansively, no doubt holding forth on some topic he considered important. Theodore Ashford stood nearby, his expensive suit already showing signs of the morning heat. Both men had been particularly persistent in their courtship lately, spurred on perhaps by her father's none too subtle hints that it was time for Virginia to choose a husband. As she approached, Virginia noticed a figure leaning against a hitching post, slightly apart from the group. The man was tall and lean, his clothes worn but clean, his hat pulled low enough to shadow his face. Dust coated his boots and the knees of his pants, suggesting recent travel. A stranger then, or at least someone she didn't recognize. In a town like Crossbow Ridge, strangers were notable, especially ones who carried themselves with such quiet stillness. The morning was unfolding exactly as Virginia expected until she reached her wagon and discovered that it wasn't going anywhere. The left rear wheel sat at an odd angle, clearly damaged beyond the ability of her usual driver to repair. The axle had somehow been compromised, and the wooden wheel itself showed signs of significant wear. Virginia stared at the broken wagon with growing frustration. She had promised deliveries to 3 different mining camps today, and delays meant lost revenue, disappointed customers, and questions about the reliability of Hale operations. "Miss Hale," Marcus Whitman hurried to her side, his face flushed with the exertion of moving quickly in the morning heat. "I see you've encountered some difficulty. Perhaps I could arrange for one of my father's bank employees to assist you with alternative transportation." Virginia bit back her initial sharp response. Marcus meant well, but his solution involved bureaucracy and delay when what she needed was immediate action. "Thank you, Marcus, but what I need is someone who can fix this wheel, not arrange a committee to discuss it." Theodore Ashford joined them, dabbing at his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Surely this is a matter for your employees to handle, Virginia. A lady shouldn't concern herself with such mechanical difficulties. Perhaps we could adjourn to the hotel for refreshments while arrangements are made." The suggestion that she retreat to feminine seclusion while others handled her business problems sparked Virginia's temper. She had been managing aspects of her father's operations since she was 16, and she understood every facet of the freight business, from loading procedures to route planning. The idea that she should hide in a hotel parlor while her competitors gained advantage made her jaw clench. "What I need," Virginia said, her voice carrying clearly across the small crowd that had gathered to watch the drama unfold, "is someone with the practical skills to solve a practical problem. Not someone who thinks the solution to a broken wheel is afternoon tea." Her words created a ripple of uncomfortable laughter from the assembled townspeople. Marcus and Theodore exchanged glances, both looking slightly offended but uncertain how to respond. Virginia felt a moment of satisfaction at having made her point, but the broken wagon remained broken, and her frustration continued to mount. It was then that the stranger straightened up from his position against the hitching post. He was older than Virginia had initially thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that showed the calluses and scars of someone who worked with tools and machinery. His clothes marked him as a drifter, someone without permanent employment or fixed address, exactly the sort of person Virginia would normally dismiss without a second thought. But something in his posture caught her attention. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew his capabilities, and his gaze as it swept over the damaged wagon was analytical rather than curious. When his eyes met hers briefly, Virginia saw intelligence there, and something else, a kind of patient assessment that made her suddenly aware of how she must appear to him. A well-dressed woman surrounded by useless men, faced with a problem none of them could solve. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and challenge. Virginia felt an unexpected impulse to test this quiet stranger, to see if his confidence was justified or merely the swagger of another man who promised more than he could deliver. What happened next would change everything, though in that moment Virginia simply acted on impulse and growing irritation with the useless men around her. The stranger's name, she would later learn, was Wes Calder, though most people called him Wes. He had arrived in Crossbow Ridge 3 days earlier, carrying everything he owned in a worn saddlebag and leading a horse that had seen better days but was clearly well cared for. Unlike the dandies who surrounded Virginia, Wes had spent the morning observing rather than talking, watching the rhythm of the town with the attention of someone who understood that survival often depended on reading situations correctly. He had noticed Virginia Hale immediately, not because of her beauty, though she was undeniably attractive, but because of the way she carried herself. There was authority in her bearing, a sense of purpose that distinguished her from the other well-dressed women who moved through the market like decorative butterflies. When he saw her examining the broken wagon with genuine frustration rather than helpless dismay, his assessment of her shifted from polite disinterest to something approaching respect. Wes had been a ranch foreman for 8 years before drought and economic pressures forced him onto the road. He understood machinery, animals, and the hard mathematics of making things work under difficult conditions. More importantly, he understood people, especially the type of people who talked loudly about their capabilities while demonstrating very little actual competence. The 2 men hovering around Virginia struck him as exactly that type. Their clothes were expensive, their speech educated, but their hands were soft and their suggestions impractical. When the banker's son proposed arranging alternative transportation and the mining heir suggested retreating for refreshments, Wes recognized the responses of men who had never faced genuine adversity or been required to solve problems with their own skills. Virginia Hale, on the other hand, clearly understood that business problems required business solutions. Her sharp dismissal of their suggestions revealed both intelligence and impatience with incompetence. Wes found himself curious about what she would do next, how she would handle the gap between needing help and being surrounded by people who couldn't provide it. The crowd around the wagon had grown as word of the breakdown spread through the market. In a small town, any disruption to routine became entertainment, and the sight of the wealthy Miss Hale faced with a practical problem drew spectators like moths to flame. Wes could see the calculation in their eyes, some hoped for drama, others for the satisfaction of watching privilege encounter the limitations of reality. Virginia seemed oblivious to the growing audience, focused entirely on the damaged wheel and the implications for her business operations. Wes admired that concentration, the way she prioritized substance over appearance, even when faced with public scrutiny. It suggested depths beneath the polished surface, complexity that her suitors seemed incapable of recognizing. The morning heat was building, and the delay was costing Virginia money with each passing minute. The mining camps expected their supplies on schedule, and reputation in the freight business depended on reliability. Wes had seen similar situations destroy smaller operations when critical deliveries failed to arrive as promised. He also understood the social dynamics at play. As a drifter with no local connections or obvious resources, he occupied the lowest rung of Crossbow Ridge's social hierarchy. Any interaction with Virginia Hale would be scrutinized and judged, not just by her but by everyone watching. The smart thing would be to mind his own business, avoid drawing attention to himself, and let the situation resolve itself without his involvement. But Wes had never been particularly good at taking the safe path when he saw a problem he could solve. Besides, there was something about Virginia's obvious competence trapped by social expectations that bothered him. She clearly knew what needed to be done, but couldn't do it herself because of the constraints placed on women of her station. The men around her offered only useless alternatives because they lacked the practical skills to address the actual problem. It was a waste of resources, both human and material, and Wes had spent too many years watching waste lead to failure to ignore it now. He pushed himself away from the hitching post and approached the edge of the crowd, not intruding but positioning himself where he could get a better look at the damaged wheel. The problem was immediately obvious to someone with his experience. The axle pin had worked loose and needed to be reset, while the wheel itself required a temporary repair that would hold long enough for proper maintenance. The repair would take perhaps 20 minutes for someone who knew what he was doing, and the materials needed were simple enough to find in any well-equipped town. It was exactly the sort of practical problem that Virginia needed solved and that her useless suitors were incapable of addressing. Wes found himself making a decision that would complicate his life considerably, though he didn't fully understand that yet. All he knew was that watching competence trapped by incompetence offended his sense of how things ought to work, and he had never been good at walking away from problems he could fix. The morning sun climbed higher, the crowd grew larger, and Virginia's frustration became more obvious with each passing minute. Marcus Whitman and Theodore Ashford continued offering impractical solutions with increasing desperation, apparently recognizing that their inability to help was making them look foolish in front of the woman they were both courting. That was when Virginia's temper finally overflowed, and she made the challenge that would change both their lives forever. Standing beside her broken wagon, surrounded by useless men and growing spectacle, Virginia turned toward the watching crowd with the dangerous smile of someone who had reached the end of her patience. Her gaze swept across the assembled faces before settling on the quiet stranger leaning against the hitching post. "You there?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "You look like someone who might actually know which end of a tool to hold." The crowd stirred with anticipation, sensing drama. Wes straightened, understanding that he was being drawn into something larger than a simple, mechanical problem. Virginia's challenge carried weight beyond its words. It was a test, a gamble, and possibly a mistake all wrapped into one impulsive gesture. But it was also an opportunity, and Wes had learned long ago that opportunity rarely announced itself politely or arrived at convenient times. The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and every person in the market square held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Virginia's words had been spoken loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, and there was no taking them back now. She had publicly acknowledged the stranger, elevating him from invisible drifter to participant in the morning's drama. Wes felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him as he straightened from his position against the hitching post. The leather tool belt around his waist, cracked and worn from years of hard use, suddenly felt heavier, more significant. He had carried these tools across 3 territories, through drought and prosperity, success and failure. They were extensions of his hands, as familiar as breathing, and right now they represented the difference between Virginia's continued humiliation and a solution to her problem. "Ma'am," Wes said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respectful acknowledgement. His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who knew his capabilities. "I might be able to help with that wheel." Virginia's eyes flashed with something between desperation and defiance. She was committed now, having made her challenge public, and backing down would only compound her embarrassment. "Help?" she repeated, her voice sharp with barely controlled frustration. "Everyone's been offering to help. What I need is someone who can actually fix it." The crowd stirred again, sensing the escalation. Marcus Whitman stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Miss Hale, surely you don't intend to trust your property to a—" He gestured vaguely at Wes, his meaning clear, even if he was too well bred to finish the sentence. "To a what, Marcus?" Virginia's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Someone who might actually possess useful skills? Someone who doesn't think the solution to every problem is to form a committee or retreat to the hotel." Theodore Ashford cleared his throat nervously. "Virginia, perhaps we should consider the proprieties here. What will people think if you—" "What will people think?" Virginia's laugh was sharp and bitter. "They'll think I'm a woman who gets things done instead of standing around wringing her hands while her business suffers." The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of the wealthy merchant's daughter publicly challenging social conventions. Wes could see the calculation in their faces, some delighted by the drama, others shocked by Virginia's breach of proper behavior. In a town like Crossbow Ridge, this conversation would be retold and analyzed for weeks. "Tell you what," Virginia said, her voice rising as her temper finally broke free of social constraints. She gestured toward the broken wagon with theatrical flourish. "You fix my wagon, and it's yours. Take it, sell it, burn it for firewood, I don't care. But if you can actually make it roll again in the next hour, it belongs to you." The offer was outrageous by any measure. The wagon alone was worth more than most workers earned in 6 months, and loaded with supplies bound for the mining camps, it represented a fortune to someone of Wes's apparent circumstances. Virginia was essentially betting a significant portion of her wealth on the competence of a stranger, and doing it in front of the entire town. Marcus Whitman's face went pale. "Virginia, you can't be serious. That wagon is worth—" "I know exactly what it's worth," Virginia snapped. "The question is whether anyone here knows how to earn it." Wes studied Virginia's face, reading the complex mixture of emotions playing across her features. Anger, certainly, and frustration with the incompetent men surrounding her. But beneath that, he saw something else: desperate need to prove that practical problems could have practical solutions, that competence could triumph over empty social posturing. She was gambling more than money, he realized. She was betting her reputation, her standing in the community, possibly her future, on the chance that someone might possess the skills her privileged suitors lacked. "That's a generous offer, ma'am," Wes said quietly. "But I wouldn't feel right taking your wagon. How about this instead? I fix it, and you pay me standard wages for the work. Fair enough?" Virginia stared at him for a long moment, clearly not having expected this response. Everyone around them waited to see how she would react to having her dramatic gesture deflated by simple reasonableness. "Fine," she said finally, "but the same conditions apply. You have 1 hour to make it roadworthy, or you get nothing and walk away." Wes nodded and approached the damaged wagon, the crowd parting to give him space. He knelt beside the broken wheel, running his hands over the axle and examining the damage with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that correct diagnosis was the first step toward effective repair. The problem was immediately clear to his experienced eye. The axle pin had worked loose due to worn securing hardware, allowing the wheel to shift out of alignment. The wheel itself showed stress damage, but was structurally sound. With the right approach and basic materials, it was entirely fixable. More importantly, it was fixable with tools and supplies readily available in any frontier town. Wes's tool belt contained most of what he needed, and the rest could be improvised or borrowed from nearby shops. "I'll need some pine stock about 2 inches thick," he said, standing and addressing Virginia directly, "and access to a forge for maybe 10 minutes. Virginia gestured toward the blacksmith shop across the square. "Samuel owes my family favors. Take whatever you need." As Wes walked toward the blacksmith shop, the crowd followed at a respectful distance, clearly unwilling to miss whatever happened next. Virginia remained beside her wagon, arms crossed, watching his every move with the intensity of someone whose entire future might depend on the next hour's events. The blacksmith, a massive man named Samuel Burke, looked up from his work as Wes approached. "You the fellow trying to fix Miss Hale's wagon?" "Yes, sir. I need to heat and reshape a pin, maybe forge a couple of brackets. Won't take long." Samuel studied Wes for a moment, taking in the worn clothes and weathered hands. "You know what you're doing, son." "I do." Something in Wes's quiet confidence must have convinced the blacksmith, because Samuel nodded toward his forge. "Help yourself. Iron stock's over there if you need it." For the next 40 minutes, Wes worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that failure was not an option. He carved new securing blocks from pine, reshaped the axle pin at the forge, and fabricated replacement brackets with economical precision. His movements were deliberate and sure, each action building logically toward the solution. The crowd watched in fascination as the broken wagon gradually transformed under his skilled hands. Virginia stood closest, no longer trying to maintain social distance, openly studying his techniques with the sharp attention of someone who appreciated competence when she saw it. When Wes finally stood and dusted off his hands, the wagon sat level and solid, the repaired wheel as secure as the day it was built. He had finished with 15 minutes to spare. "Where would you like me to park it, Ma'am?" he asked, touching his hat brim again with that same quiet courtesy. Virginia stared at the repaired wagon, then at Wes, then back at the wagon. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, broken only by the whispered conversations of the watching crowd. Finally, she walked around the wagon, examining his work with professional thoroughness. She tested the wheel, checked the axle, even climbed up to inspect the wagon bed. When she finished her examination, her expression was unreadable. "It's better than it was before," she said quietly. "Stronger." Wes nodded. "Should serve you well for years, provided you maintain the hardware." The crowd began to disperse. The drama apparently concluded, but Virginia remained beside the wagon, studying Wes with new eyes. Everything she thought she understood about measuring a man's worth had just been challenged by 15 minutes of competent work. Marcus Whitman and Theodore Ashford had slipped away during the repair process, apparently recognizing that their continued presence would only emphasize their uselessness. Their absence left Virginia alone with Wes, and the uncomfortable realization that she owed this stranger more than money. She owed him an apology for her assumptions, recognition for his skills, and possibly a complete re-evaluation of everything she thought she knew about worth and value. But admitting that would require acknowledging that she had been wrong about more than just one man. She had been wrong about what mattered, what had value, what deserved respect. And Virginia Hale had never been comfortable with being wrong about anything. The weight of Virginia's pearl necklace seemed heavier as she stood beside the perfectly repaired wagon, acutely aware that half the town had witnessed her public gamble and its unexpected outcome. The practical part of her mind, the part trained in business, matters recognized that she had just discovered exactly the kind of competent employee her father's freight operation needed. The social part of her mind, however, recoiled at the implications of what had just transpired. She had publicly acknowledged a drifter, challenged him to prove his worth, and been forced to admit that he possessed skills none of her approved suitors could match. Worse, she had done it all in front of an audience that would spend the next week dissecting every word and gesture for gossip fodder. "Mr. Calder," she said finally, her voice carefully modulated to project business-like professionalism rather than the confusion she actually felt. "I believe we should discuss terms." Wes had been preparing to take his leave, clearly recognizing the social awkwardness of the situation. Virginia's words stopped him mid-step, and he turned back with raised eyebrows. "Terms, ma'am?" "For employment." Virginia lifted her chin slightly, the gesture automatic whenever she felt uncertain. "You've demonstrated valuable skills, and my family's business can always use competent workers. I'm prepared to offer you regular freight hauling contracts." The offer surprised even Virginia herself. She had spoken impulsively, driven by some combination of gratitude, embarrassment, and genuine recognition of Wes's abilities. But once the words were spoken, she realized they made perfect business sense. Her father was always complaining about the difficulty of finding reliable drivers and mechanics for their expanding operations. Wes studied her face carefully, as if trying to determine whether the offer was genuine or simply an attempt to salvage her dignity after the morning's events. "That's generous, Miss Hale, but I'm not sure your family would approve of hiring a drifter based on one wagon repair." "My family approves of competence," Virginia replied firmly, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "Results matter more than pedigree in the freight business." Even as she spoke, Virginia could see the challenge this would present. Her father valued social connections and business relationships as much as practical skills. Hiring Wes would require explanation, justification, and probably considerable persuasion. But the alternative, pretending this morning's demonstration hadn't happened, seemed somehow worse. "I'll need to discuss this with my father, of course," she continued, already formulating arguments for Edmund Hale's practical nature. But if you're interested, I suggest you present yourself at our offices tomorrow morning. We're located above the main mercantile on Commerce Street." Wes nodded slowly. "I appreciate the opportunity, Miss Hale. I'll be there." As he turned to go, Virginia felt an unexpected impulse to say something more, to acknowledge what had really happened here. But the words wouldn't come, and she watched him walk away with the same quiet confidence he had shown throughout the entire encounter. The remaining spectators drifted away, leaving Virginia alone with her repaired wagon and the uncomfortable realization that she had just complicated her life considerably. Hiring Wes Calder would require explaining her decision to her father, defending it to her social circle, and probably enduring considerable speculation about her motives. But as she climbed onto the wagon seat and felt the smooth, solid roll of the expertly repaired wheel, Virginia found herself looking forward to that conversation more than she had expected. The ride to her father's office gave her time to organize her arguments. Edmund Hale had built his fortune by recognizing value wherever he found it, and he understood the freight business well enough to appreciate genuine competence. If she presented Wes's hiring as a practical business decision, which it was her father would likely approve despite any social reservations, the Hale Mercantile occupied the largest building on Commerce Street, a 3-story structure that housed the retail operation on the ground floor, business offices on the 2nd floor, and living quarters on the 3rd. Virginia had grown up in those rooms above the store, learning to calculate profit margins before she learned to embroider, understanding supply chains before she understood poetry. She found her father in his usual morning position, reviewing ledgers at the massive oak desk that dominated his office. Edmund Hale was 57 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the careful posture of a man who had spent decades building something substantial from nothing. His eyes, the same green as Virginia's, looked up sharply as she entered. "You're late," he observed without reproach. "Problems with the mining camp deliveries?" "Mechanical difficulties," Virginia replied, settling into the chair across from his desk, but resolved now. Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly. "Marcus mentioned some drama in the market square, something about you making public wagers with strangers." Virginia suppressed a flash of irritation at Marcus Whitman's interference. "I discovered a valuable potential employee and took steps to evaluate his capabilities. By betting your wagon in front of half the town, by testing his skills under pressure." Virginia countered, "Father, we've been discussing the need for more reliable mechanics and drivers for months. I found someone who can deliver both." Edmund leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with the analytical attention he usually reserved for business contracts. "Tell me about this man." Virginia chose her words carefully, emphasizing Wes's demonstrated competence while minimizing the social complications his hiring might create. She described the wagon repair in detail, highlighting the speed, skill, and improvisational ability he had shown. "He completed a repair that would have taken our usual mechanics half a day," she concluded, "and he did it with hand tools and salvaged materials. That's exactly the kind of resourcefulness we need for the remote route deliveries." Edmund nodded thoughtfully. "Practical skills are valuable, certainly. But Virginia, you understand the broader implications here. Hiring a drifter with no local connections will raise questions." "It will also solve problems," Virginia replied. "And ultimately, results matter more than speculation." Her father smiled slightly, recognizing his own business philosophy reflected in her words. "Very well. Bring him in tomorrow, and I'll evaluate him myself." "But Virginia," his expression grew serious. "Be careful about the impression this creates. People will assume your interest in this man extends beyond his mechanical abilities." Virginia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "That's ridiculous. This is purely a business decision." "Perhaps, but in a town like Crossbow Ridge, perception often matters more than reality. Just remember that your choices reflect on more than yourself." As Virginia left her father's office, she carried both satisfaction at having won his provisional approval and unease at his warning about public perception. She had acted on impulse this morning, driven by frustration and genuine appreciation for competence. But Edmund was riother. Actions would be interpreted through the lens of social expectations and romantic speculation. The thought bothered her more than it should have. She had made a practical business decision based on demonstrated results. If people chose to read romantic implications into professional evaluation, that was their failure of imagination, not her responsibility. But even as Virginia told herself this, she found her thoughts returning to the quiet confidence in Wes Calder's voice, the sure movement of his skilled hands, and the way he had deflated her dramatic gesture with simple reasonableness. Perhaps her father's concerns weren't entirely misplaced after all. The afternoon passed in routine business activities, but Virginia found her concentration scattered. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the morning's events, as friends and business associates sought details about her encounter with the mysterious stranger. Virginia answered their questions with professional brevity, emphasizing the business aspects of her decision while deflecting speculation about personal motives. By evening, she was exhausted from the constant need to defend and explain her choices. As she prepared for bed in her comfortable rooms above the store, Virginia found herself questioning whether hiring Wes Calder was worth the social complications it seemed certain to create. But then she remembered the smooth roll of the repaired wagon, the methodical precision of his work, and the quiet dignity with which he had handled her public challenge. Whatever social difficulties might arise, she had found exactly what her father's business needed: someone who could solve problems rather than create them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, Virginia allowed herself to feel satisfied with a decision well made, whatever the consequences might prove to be. The leather-bound ledger book lay open on Edmund Hale's desk, like a testament to 3 decades of careful business building. Each entry represented a calculated risk, a successful venture, or a lesson learned through expensive experience. As Virginia sat across from her father the next morning, she could see him mentally adding Wes Calder's potential employment to those pages, another decision that would either strengthen or compromise the Hale family legacy. "Before you bring this man in," Edmund said, turning a page in his ledger with deliberate care, "there are matters we need to discuss. Marcus Whitman's father paid me a visit last evening." Virginia's stomach tightened. The elder Whitman controlled the largest bank in the territory, and his opinion carried considerable weight in Crossbow Ridge's business community. "And?" "He expressed concern about your judgment. Specifically, your tendency to make impulsive decisions that could affect your marriage prospects." Edmund's voice remained neutral, but Virginia caught the warning beneath his words. "He suggested that a formal engagement might help stabilize your reputation." The suggestion hit Virginia like a physical blow. Marriage to Marcus Whitman would solve her father's concerns about social propriety and business alliances, but it would also trap her in a life of suffocating predictability. Marcus was competent enough at banking procedures, but he lacked imagination, humor, or any quality that might make their inevitable conversations interesting. "Father, surely you're not considering arranging my marriage based on bankers' gossip about yesterday's wagon repair?" Edmund closed the ledger and studied his daughter with the same careful attention he gave to complex contracts. "I'm considering the reality that your behavior is attracting attention, not all of it favorable." Before Virginia could respond, a knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. Edmund's clerk announced that Wesley Calder had arrived for his appointment. Virginia felt her pulse quicken as her father instructed that Wes be shown in. Wes entered the office with the same quiet confidence he had displayed the previous day, though Virginia noticed that he had made efforts to improve his appearance. His clothes were clean and pressed, his hair neatly trimmed, and his boots freshly polished. The changes were subtle but significant. They showed respect for the opportunity without attempting to disguise his working-class origins. "Mr. Calder," Edmund rose and extended his hand in greeting. "Virginia tells me you possess useful skills." "I try to be helpful, sir." Wes's handshake was firm but not aggressive, and he met Edmund's appraising gaze steadily. "I understand you might have work for someone with my experience." For the next 20 minutes, Edmund conducted the most thorough job interview Virginia had ever witnessed. He questioned Wes about his background, his experience with freight operations, his knowledge of routes and schedules, and his understanding of the practical challenges facing territorial commerce. Wes answered each question with concise competence, demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond simple mechanical skills. He understood supply chain logistics, seasonal variations in demand, and the delicate balance between speed and safety that governed profitable freight operations. Most impressively, he offered suggestions for improving efficiency without being asked. The northern mining camps could be served more effectively with smaller, more frequent deliveries, Wes observed when Edmund mentioned scheduling difficulties. Heavy loads slow travel time and increase wear on equipment. Better to run light loads twice weekly than struggle with overloaded wagons once. Virginia watched her father's expression shift from skeptical evaluation to genuine interest as Wes continued demonstrating practical wisdom gained through hard experience. This wasn't just a skilled mechanic, this was someone who understood the freight business from multiple perspectives and could contribute to its improvement. "Your suggestions have merit," Edmund admitted. "What would you expect in terms of compensation?" "Standard wages for the work performed," Wes replied. "I'm not looking for charity, just the opportunity to prove my worth." Edmund nodded approvingly. In his world, people who asked for opportunity rather than guarantees were more likely to succeed. "Very well. Virginia will assign you initial routes and evaluate your performance. If you prove reliable, we'll discuss more permanent arrangements." As Wes left the office with instructions to report to the freight yard the following morning, Virginia felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. She had successfully advocated for his hiring, but now his performance would reflect directly on her judgment. "He's more capable than I expected," Edmund observed once they were alone. "But Virginia, his competence doesn't address the social complications his presence might create." "What social complications? He's an employee, nothing more." Edmund's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her protest. "Just remember that perception shapes reality in matters of business and reputation. Be careful how you manage this situation." That afternoon, Virginia found herself defending her decision yet again when Theodore Ashford appeared at the mercantile, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but clearly seeking information about her morning's activities. "I heard you've hired that drifter who fixed your wagon," Theodore said, his tone carefully neutral. "Quite an unusual decision." "It's a business decision based on demonstrated competence," Virginia replied, focusing on the inventory ledger to avoid meeting his eyes. "My father values practical skills." "Of course, though I hope you're being careful about the impression this creates. People are beginning to talk." Virginia looked up sharply. "Talk about what exactly?" Theodore's discomfort was obvious, but he pressed forward with the dogged persistence of someone who believed his concerns were justified. "About your fascination with this man." "Virginia, I understand the appeal of competence, but you must consider how your attention appears to others." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Virginia had found herself thinking about Wes Calder more than strictly necessary, replaying their brief conversations and wondering about his background. But that was natural curiosity about a new employee, nothing more. "My attention is focused on business efficiency," she said firmly. "If people choose to interpret professional evaluation as personal fascination, that reveals more about their limitations than my motivations." Theodore clearly wanted to say more, but Virginia's tone discouraged further discussion. He completed his purchases and left, though not before expressing hope that her judgment would prove sound. As the day wore on, Virginia realized that Wes Calder's employment would require more than just work assignment. It would require careful management of social perceptions and potential conflicts. Her father was right about the complications his presence might create. But when she thought about the smooth efficiency of his wagon repair, the thoughtful insights he had offered during his interview, and the quiet dignity with which he had handled every interaction, Virginia found herself looking forward to working with someone who solved problems rather than creating them. Whatever challenges might arise, she had made the right decision for the right reasons. If Crossbow Ridge society chose to complicate that with romantic speculation and social disapproval, she would handle those problems as they emerged. The alternative surrounding herself only with incompetent but socially approved men like Marcus and Theodore seemed far worse than dealing with gossip about her professional choices. Evening found Virginia in her rooms above the store, reviewing route schedules and cargo manifests for Wes's initial assignments. She had decided to start him with shorter local deliveries where his performance could be easily monitored and any problems quickly addressed. As she worked, Virginia realized she was genuinely excited about having a competent employee to work with. For too long, she had been surrounded by people who either couldn't understand her business concerns or couldn't contribute meaningfully to solving them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in months, Virginia felt optimistic about her ability to handle whatever complications might arise. She had found exactly what her father's business needed, someone who understood that results mattered more than appearances. The rest, she told herself firmly, was just small-town gossip that would fade once people saw the practical benefits of her decision. The small wooden horse fit perfectly in Virginia's palm, its surface smooth from careful sanding and detailed with intricate carved mane and delicate features that spoke of hours of patient work. She had discovered it quite by accident, left on a freight dock after Wes had departed from his morning deliveries. When she asked around, old Samuel at the blacksmith shop mentioned that the drifter had given it to his grandson, a shy boy of 7, who had been admiring Wes's horse during a delivery stop. "Carved it right there while we loaded the wagon," Samuel had explained, his weathered face creasing into an approving smile. "Boy's been carrying it everywhere since. Takes real patience to do work that fine." Virginia turned the little horse over in her hands, studying the careful attention to detail in something created purely as a gift for a child. It spoke to a gentleness in Wes Calder that complicated her understanding of him even further. She had hired him for his mechanical competence, but each day revealed additional layers to his character that challenged her assumptions about drifters, working men, and the relationship between social position and personal worth. Over the past 2 weeks, Wes had proven himself invaluable to the Hale freight operations. His deliveries were always punctual, his cargo handling careful and secure, and his mechanical innovations had increased efficiency across multiple routes. More importantly, he had begun earning respect from other drivers and dock workersmen who typically viewed outsiders with suspicion but recognized genuine competence when they saw it. Virginia found herself looking forward to his daily reports, partly because they provided useful business intelligence, but increasingly because she enjoyed their brief conversations. Wes had a way of observing details that others missed: which merchants were struggling financially, which routes were becoming dangerous due to increased bandit activity, which communities needed supplies they couldn't afford to request. "The settlement at Pine Creek is having troubles," he had mentioned during yesterday's report. "Saw signs of sickness among the children, and their usual orders are down by half. Might be worth checking if they need credit terms or medical supplies." His observation had led to a profitable arrangement, providing medicine on delayed payment terms, helping the settlement while creating future business for the Hale operation. Virginia was beginning to understand that Wes possessed not just mechanical skills, but genuine business insight gained through careful observation and practical experience. But her growing appreciation for his abilities was creating exactly the social complications her father had warned against. The situation came to a head when Charlotte Morrison, her closest friend among Crossbow Ridge's social elite, paid an unexpected visit to the mercantile. Charlotte was the judge's daughter, a woman whose opinions carried significant weight in determining social acceptability, and her expression suggested she had come with a specific purpose. "Virginia, dear, I feel I must speak frankly about your recent associations," Charlotte began without preamble. "People are talking, and not kindly." Virginia set down the inventory list she had been reviewing and gave Charlotte her full attention. "What exactly are people saying?" That you're showing unseemly interest in that drifter you hired, that you seek him out for conversations that go well beyond business necessity, that you defend him against criticism with suspicious passion. Charlotte's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone delivering necessary but unwelcome truth. People are beginning to question your judgment. My judgment has been vindicated by results, Virginia replied carefully. Mr. Calder has improved our operations considerably. I'm sure he's competent at whatever it is he does, Charlotte said dismissively. But Virginia, competence isn't the issue here. Propriety is. You're an unmarried woman of good family, and your behavior with this man is creating speculation that could damage your reputation permanently. Virginia felt a familiar flash of irritation at the suggestion that professional interactions with a male employee somehow compromised her virtue. Charlotte, I work in my family's business. I interact with male employees daily. How is Mr. Calder different? Because you don't look at other employees the way you look at him, Charlotte replied bluntly. Because you don't defend other employees with such passion when people question their presence. Because other employees don't make you smile the way he does. The accusation hit closer to home than Virginia wanted to admit. She had noticed herself anticipating Wes's visits, enjoying their conversations more than strictly necessary, and yes, probably defending him more vigorously than she would other employees. But that was because he was more capable than other employees, more insightful, more interesting to talk with. Wasn't it? I appreciate your concern, Virginia said finally, but I believe you're overestimating the significance of normal business interactions. Charlotte studied her friend's face with the penetrating attention of someone who had known her since childhood. Virginia, I've watched you turn away a dozen suitors without a second thought, but this man-this drifter, with nothing to recommend him but practical skill-shas, captured your attention in a way that all those wealthy, well-bred gentlemen never could. Don't you think that's worth examining? Before Virginia could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Whitman, whose timing seemed suspiciously convenient. He greeted both women with elaborate courtesy, but his attention focused immediately on Virginia. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, though his tone suggested he hoped exactly the opposite. I wanted to discuss some business matters with you, Virginia. Charlotte excused herself with meaningful glances that suggested their conversation was far from finished. Marcus waited until she was gone before settling into the chair across from Virginia's desk with the proprietary air of someone who assumed welcome. I've been talking with my father about our family's business relationship, he began without preamble. We believe there are significant opportunities for expansion if our operations were more formally connected. Virginia understood the subtext immediately. The Whitmans were proposing a merger that would require marriage between Marcus and herself, a business alliance disguised as romantic attachment, but motivated entirely by financial considerations. What sort of formal connection did you have in mind? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus leaned forward with the earnest expression he probably thought looked sincere. Virginia, I believe we could build something significant together. Our family's resources, properly combined, could dominate territorial commerce. And personally, he paused for effect. I've always admired your intelligence and business acumen. I think we could be very compatible. The proposal was everything Virginia should have wanted: security, social approval, business expansion, and marriage to a man from her own social class. Marcus was handsome enough, wealthy enough, and well-connected enough to satisfy every practical consideration. But as she looked at his carefully groomed appearance and listened to his rehearsed romantic language, Virginia found herself thinking about weathered hands creating delicate wooden toys for children, about quiet observations that led to profitable innovations, about conversations that challenged her thinking rather than confirming her existing beliefs. That's very flattering, Marcus, she said carefully, but I'm not prepared to make such significant decisions right now. Marcus's expression tightened slightly. Virginia, I hope you're not allowing temporary fascinations to cloud your judgment about long-term considerations. People are talking about your association with that drifter, and frankly, it's beginning to affect how others view your family's business." The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. If Virginia continued her professional relationship with Wes, it would damage her reputation and potentially hurt her father's business interests. Marriage to Marcus would solve both problems while providing the social stability everyone seemed to think she needed. "I appreciate your concern," Virginia replied, her voice cooling noticeably, "but my business decisions are based on results, not gossip." "Sometimes gossip becomes reality," Marcus warned. "Sometimes social opinion shapes business relationships in ways that can't be ignored. I hope you'll think carefully about what's truly important to you." After Marcus left, Virginia sat alone in her office, staring at the carved wooden horse and trying to sort through the conflicting pressures surrounding her. Everyone seemed convinced that her interest in Wes Calder was inappropriate, dangerous, or both. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was allowing personal attraction to compromise her professional judgment. But when she thought about the practical improvements he had brought to their operations, the insights he had shared, the quiet competence he demonstrated daily, Virginia couldn't convince herself that hiring him had been a mistake. The problem wasn't Wes Calder's capabilities, it was other people's assumptions about why she valued those capabilities. And increasingly, Virginia was beginning to suspect that those assumptions might not be entirely wrong. Virginia's mother's wedding ring caught the afternoon light as she turned it nervously around her finger, a habit she had developed whenever facing difficult decisions. The simple gold band, worn smooth by decades of wear, represented 4 generations of Hale women who had married for practical reasons, who had built stable lives through careful choices and social propriety. As she sat in her father's office, listening to him outline the benefits of accepting Marcus Whitman's proposal, Virginia felt the weight of that tradition pressing down on her like a physical burden. "The Whitman alliance would secure our banking relationships for the next generation," Edmund was saying, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for important business discussions. "Marcus is competent, well-educated, and from a good family. Most importantly, the marriage would end speculation about your recent associations." Virginia stopped turning the ring and looked up sharply. "You mean my employment of Mr. Calder?" "I mean the talk that's beginning to affect our business relationships," Edmund replied firmly. 3 merchants have mentioned concerns about your judgment. The territorial governor's wife made pointed comments about propriety at last week's social gathering. This isn't just gossip anymore. Virginia, it's becoming a liability. The words stung because Virginia knew they contained truth. She had noticed increased scrutiny in her social interactions, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, invitations that seemed to arrive with less frequency. Her decision to hire Wes Calder had created exactly the complications her father had predicted. "But Mr. Calder's performance has been exemplary," she protested. "His innovations have increased our profits by 15% in just 3 weeks. "His competence isn't in question," Edmund said patiently. "His social position is. Virginia, you're 23 years old. It's time to think seriously about marriage, about securing your future and maintaining the family's standing in the community." Before Virginia could respond, a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Her father's clerk announced that Mr. Calder had arrived with the weekly route reports. Edmund's expression tightened slightly. "Send him in," he said, then added quietly to Virginia, "This will be a good opportunity to observe the situation objectively." Wes entered the office with his usual quiet confidence, carrying a leather satchel containing detailed reports from his various deliveries. Virginia found herself noticing things she had tried to ignore. The way his presence seemed to fill the room, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the careful respect he showed her father, despite the obvious tension. "Sir, ma'am," he greeted them both with a slight nod. "The northern routes are all completed on schedule. I've noted some concerns about the bridge at Miller's Creek. It's showing stress signs and should be inspected before winter." Edmund accepted the reports and reviewed them with professional attention. Despite his concerns about social propriety, he couldn't fault Wes's work quality or business insights. The route reports were thorough, well-organized, and included valuable observations about infrastructure and market conditions. Your suggestion about the Pine Creek settlement proved profitable, Edmund admitted grudgingly. Their delayed payment arrangement has led to increased orders from 2 neighboring communities. Glad to hear it, sir. People appreciate flexibility during hard times, and it usually pays back with loyalty. Virginia watched the interaction carefully, noting her father's reluctant approval of Wes's business acumen. Despite his social reservations, Edmund recognized competence when he saw it. The problem wasn't Wes's qualifications, it was the perception that Virginia's interest in him extended beyond professional appreciation. "Mr. Calder," Edmund said suddenly, "I understand you've had experience managing ranch operations." "Yes, sir. I was foreman at the R for 8 years before drought forced them to reduce operations. Why didn't you seek similar positions elsewhere?" Wes was quiet for a moment, and Virginia sensed he was choosing his words carefully. The drought affected most ranches in the region. Those still operating had to keep their existing crews. I decided to try different work rather than displace men with families to support. The answer revealed character that went beyond simple job qualifications. Wes had chosen hardship for himself rather than taking positions from others who needed them more desperately. It was exactly the kind of principled decision that impressed Virginia and worried her father. After Wes left, Edmund turned to his daughter with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. "He's an impressive man, I'll grant you that. But Virginia, that only makes the situation more dangerous." "Dangerous, father? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the way you look at him, the way your voice changes when you discuss his work, the way you defend him against criticism." Edmund's voice grew gentle but firm. "Virginia, you're falling in love with him." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Virginia felt her cheeks flush as she tried to formulate a denial, but the words wouldn't come. Was she falling in love with Wes Calder? The possibility terrified her because it would complicate everything she had planned for her life. "Even if that were true," she said finally, "it wouldn't change the fact that he's valuable to our business." "It would change everything," Edmund replied. "Virginia, I've built this business over 30 years. I've seen how personal feelings can destroy professional judgment, how emotional decisions can bankrupt entire operations. You can't afford to let attraction cloud your thinking. So you want me to marry Marcus Whitman to avoid the risk of making emotional decisions? I want you to marry Marcus Whitman because it's the practical choice, because it secures your future, protects the business, and maintains the family's position in society." Edmund's voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and hard experience. "Love is a luxury, Virginia. Security is a necessity." That evening, Virginia walked through Crossbow Ridge's quiet streets, trying to sort through the conflicting pressures surrounding her. The town looked peaceful in the twilight, with warm light spilling from windows and the sound of families sharing dinner conversations. It was a good life, a stable life, built on careful choices and social conventions. But as she passed the boarding house where Wes rented a simple room, Virginia found herself wondering what conversations might be taking place behind those windows. What thoughts occupied his mind during the quiet evening hours? What dreams he carried for his future? She had always assumed that her path was predetermined: marriage to an appropriate man, continuation of the family business, maintenance of social position and financial security. But now, for the first time, she was questioning whether that predetermined path would lead to happiness or merely to the appearance of success. The next morning brought news that forced Virginia to confront her feelings more directly. Charlotte Morrison arrived at the Mercantile with information that changed everything. "I've heard from reliable sources that your father is planning to announce your engagement to Marcus Whitman at the harvest celebration," Charlotte said without preamble. "Virginia, if you have objections to this marriage, you need to voice them now." Virginia felt her stomach drop. The harvest celebration was only 2 weeks away, and it would be attended by everyone of importance in the territory. An engagement announced at such a public event would be nearly impossible to retract without enormous social consequences. My father mentioned the possibility, Virginia said carefully, but no decisions have been made. According to Martha Whitman, decisions have been made. She's already planning the wedding for next spring. Charlotte studied her friend's face with concern. Virginia, if you're going to object, you need to do it before this becomes public knowledge. After Charlotte left, Virginia sat alone in her office, staring at her mother's wedding ring and trying to imagine herself married to Marcus Whitman. The future stretched before her like a well-mapped route, comfortable, predictable, and utterly without the spark of genuine connection she had begun to crave. But the alternative, following her heart toward a man whose social position could never match her own, seemed equally impossible. Society would never accept such a match. Her father would likely disown her, and she would be trading security for an uncertain future based on feelings she wasn't even sure she understood. The choice before her was becoming clearer and more terrifying with each passing day. Soon, she would have to decide between the life she was expected to live and the life she was beginning to want, between duty and desire, between security and the possibility of genuine happiness. And time was running out to make that choice. The rolled land deed felt heavier than its simple paper construction should have warranted as Virginia unfolded it across her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she read the official territorial seal and the precise legal language that changed everything she thought she knew about Wes Calder. The document, discovered quite by accident when she had helped him retrieve scattered papers from his saddlebag after a sudden windstorm, described ownership of 1,200 acres in the mineral-rich Copper Canyon district land that geological surveys valued at more than her father's entire commercial empire. "You own the Riverside mining claim?" Virginia's voice came out as barely more than a whisper as she looked up at Wes, who stood quietly in her office doorway, his expression unreadable. "I do." His simple confirmation carried no defensiveness, no explanation, just acknowledgement of a fact that recontextualized their entire relationship. "Have for 3 years now." Virginia sank into her chair. The land deed still spread before her like evidence of a fundamental deception. The Riverside claim was legendary, in territorial mining circles, a site that had yielded more copper and silver in its first year of operation than most mines produced in a decade. Ownership of that claim made Wes Calder one of the wealthiest men in 3 territories, regardless of his simple clothes and modest living arrangements. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If you own this land, if you have access to this kind of wealth, why are you working as a freight driver? Why are you living in a boarding house and mending wagons for daily wages?" Wes entered the office fully and closed the door behind him, a gesture that suggested this conversation would require privacy. He moved with the same quiet confidence he had always shown, but now Virginia wondered if what she had interpreted as humble competence was actually the assurance of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. "Because I needed to know who I was when everything else was stripped away," Wes said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "When I inherited that land from my uncle, I discovered that wealth changes how people see you, how they treat you, how they evaluate your worth." Virginia felt heat rise in her cheeks as the implications of his words became clear. "You've been testing me, testing everyone, pretending to be poor to see how we would treat someone without money or social position." "Not pretending," Wes corrected gently, "living simply by choice. There's a difference between having wealth and flaunting it, between possessing resources and defining yourself by them." The distinction felt like splitting hairs to Virginia, whose entire world had been built on the assumption that wealth was both visible and valuable, precisely because it marked social position and personal worth. The idea that someone would deliberately obscure their financial status seemed fundamentally dishonest. "But why?" she asked, her voice rising with confusion and something approaching anger. "Why come to Crossbow Ridge? Why work for my family when you could buy and sell our entire operation without effort?" Wes was quiet for a long moment, and Virginia saw something vulnerable in his expression that she had never noticed before. Because I wanted to find someone who could see past the surface, someone who valued character over circumstances, work over wealth, substance over appearance. The words hit Virginia like a physical blow because they forced her to examine her own motivations in ways she had been avoiding. Had she fallen in love with Wes Calder, the poor but competent drifter, or with the man himself? Would her feelings have been different if she had known about his wealth from the beginning? I thought I had found that person, Wes continued, his voice carrying a note of disappointment that cut deeper than anger would have. Someone who defended my worth when others questioned it, who valued my contributions despite my apparent poverty, who saw merit where others saw only lack of social position. Virginia stared at the land deed, understanding beginning to dawn like an unwelcome sunrise. You're questioning whether my feelings are genuine, whether I fell in love with you or with the challenge of defying social expectations. Aren't you? Wes asked quietly. Now that you know I'm not actually poor, not actually beneath your social station, don't you need to examine what attracted you to me in the first place? The question forced Virginia to confront uncomfortable truths about herself and her motivations. Had she been drawn to Wes because of his competence and character, or because defying social conventions made her feel rebellious and independent? Had she fallen in love with the man, or with the romantic notion of choosing love over security? I need time to think, she said finally, folding the land deed with careful precision. This changes everything. Does it? Wes stood to leave, but paused at the door. Because from my perspective, it changes nothing about who I am or what I value. The only question is whether it changes how you see me. After he left, Virginia sat alone with the document that had shattered her understanding of everything that had happened between them. The careful timeline of their relationship played through her mind like scenes from a story she had misunderstood while reading it. Every interaction took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of Wes's hidden wealth. His deflation of her dramatic wagon offer suddenly seemed less like humble practicality and more like the amusement of someone who could have bought a dozen wagons without thinking about the cost. His insights into business operations appeared less impressive when she considered that he probably owned enterprises that dwarfed her family's freight company. Even his simple living arrangements became suspect. Was it genuine preference for modest comfort or performance designed to test the people around him? The worst part was that Virginia couldn't determine her own motivations with any certainty. She had believed herself attracted to Wes's competence, integrity, and quiet strength. But now she wondered if what had really drawn her was the opportunity to rebel against social expectations, to prove her independence by choosing an inappropriate man and defying her father's practical concerns. If Wes was wealthy, he was actually her social equal or superior then. Her choice to care for him wasn't brave or romantic. It was simply the discovery that she preferred one rich man to another, that her attraction had been based on personality rather than the dramatic social transgression she had imagined. The realization left Virginia feeling foolish and uncertain about everything she thought she had learned about herself over the past month. Had she grown and changed, or had she simply been playing at rebellion while remaining fundamentally the same shallow person who measured worth by social position? A knock at her office door interrupted her brooding. Edmund Hale entered with the grim expression of someone bearing unwelcome news. "Virginia, we need to discuss the situation with Mr. Calder," he began without preamble. "I've received some disturbing information about his background." Virginia's stomach tightened. Had her father discovered Wes's true financial status? What kind of information? "It seems our competent drifter isn't what he appears to be. According to territorial records, Wesley Calder owns significant mining properties in the Copper Canyon district, properties worth more than our entire business." Edmund's revelation confirmed what Virginia had just learned, but hearing it from her father made the deception seem even more significant. "How did you discover this?" Marcus Whitman's father had him investigated when the man's competence became too notable to ignore. Wealthy men don't usually take employment as freight drivers unless they're hiding something or playing some kind of game. Virginia felt trapped between loyalty to Wes and honesty with her father. Perhaps he has good reasons for his choices. Perhaps he's been making fools of all of us, Edmund replied grimly. Virginia, this man has been deceiving us about his true circumstances from the day he arrived. What else might he be lying about? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Virginia realized that Wes's hidden wealth didn't just complicate her feelings, it called into question everything she thought she knew about his character. A man who could lie so convincingly about something so fundamental might be capable of other deceptions as well. I want him dismissed, Edmund continued. Immediately. We don't need employees who can't be trusted to tell the truth about basic facts. Father, his work performance has been exemplary. Whatever his reasons for concealing his wealth, he's proven his value to our operations. His work performance is irrelevant if his character is questionable, Edmund replied firmly. Virginia, I'm beginning to suspect that your judgment regarding this man has been compromised from the beginning. As Virginia tried to formulate arguments for keeping Wes employed, despite his deception, she realized that her father was probably right. Her judgment had been compromised, but not in the way Edmund suspected. She had fallen in love with an idea rather than a person, with a romantic notion rather than reality. The question now was what to do with that painful knowledge, and whether there was any way to salvage something genuine from a relationship built on misunderstanding and hidden truths. The diamond engagement ring from Marcus Whitman sat in its velvet-lined box on Virginia's dressing table like a beautiful trap, catching the morning light and casting rainbow fragments across the walls of her bedroom. She had accepted the ring 3 days ago in a moment of confusion and hurt pride, driven by her father's pressure and her own uncertainty about Wes's deception. Now, with the harvest celebration only hours away and the public announcement of her engagement scheduled for that evening, Virginia felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical burden. The ring represented everything she had been raised to want: security, social position, alliance with a respectable family, and continuation of the comfortable life she had always known. Marcus had presented it with appropriate ceremony, speaking earnestly of their future together and the business advantages their marriage would create. Her father had beamed with satisfaction, and the entire Whitman family had welcomed her with enthusiasm that felt genuine, if not particularly warm. It should have been the culmination of a perfectly planned life, the logical conclusion to years of careful social positioning and practical decision-making. Instead, Virginia felt like she was preparing for her own funeral. The past week had been a whirlwind of wedding preparations, congratulations from friends and business associates, and consultations with seamstresses about her trousseau. Everyone seemed delighted by the match except Virginia herself, who found herself going through the motions with increasing desperation as the reality of her situation became clear. She had not spoken to Wes since discovering his deception about the mining claim. Edmund had dismissed him from their employment immediately after confirming his investigation, and Wes had accepted the dismissal without argument or explanation. According to town gossip, he had checked out of the boarding house and disappeared as quietly as he had arrived, leaving no forwarding address or indication of his future plans. His departure should have simplified Virginia's life, removing the source of social complications and allowing her to focus on her engagement to Marcus. Instead, his absence felt like a wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder of possibilities she had chosen to abandon. Virginia picked up the engagement ring and slipped it onto her finger, studying the way it looked against her skin. The diamond was flawless and expensive, exactly the sort of ring a woman in her position should wear. But as she stared at its perfect sparkle, all she could think about was a simple wooden horse carved with patient skill for a child who had nothing. A soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her brooding. "Virginia, dear?" Charlotte Morrison's voice carried unusual hesitancy. "May I come in?" Virginia quickly closed the ring box and called for Charlotte to enter. Her friend appeared in the doorway looking uncharacteristically serious, as if bearing news she wasn't sure how to deliver. "I hope I'm not intruding," Charlotte began, settling into the chair beside Virginia's dressing table. "But there's something I feel you should know before tonight's celebration." Virginia's stomach tightened with apprehension. "What is it?" "I've heard from several sources that Wes Calder never actually left Crossbow Ridge. He's been staying at the old Patterson cabin, about 5 miles north of town, apparently conducting some kind of business related to his mining interests." The news hit Virginia like cold water. She had assumed Wes was long gone, had built her resignation to marrying Marcus partly on the belief that the alternative had literally disappeared. Learning that he was still nearby, still accessible, still a possible choice, shattered the careful emotional barriers she had constructed around her decision. "Why are you telling me this?" Virginia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charlotte leaned forward with the earnest expression of a true friend, delivering necessary truth. "Because I've watched you for the past week, and you look like a woman preparing for execution rather than marriage. Because I've known you since we were children, and I've never seen you so miserable while making a supposedly practical decision." Virginia turned away from Charlotte's penetrating gaze, unable to meet her friend's eyes, while maintaining her pretense of satisfaction with her engagement. "Marcus is a good man. Our marriage will be beneficial for both families." "Marcus is a pleasant man who bores you senseless," Charlotte replied bluntly. "Virginia, I understand the pressures you're facing. I understand your father's concerns and the social advantages of this marriage. But I also understand that you're in love with someone else, and that person hasn't actually gone anywhere." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Virginia felt tears prick at her eyes as she realized that Charlotte saw through her careful facade with the clarity that only genuine friendship could provide. "It's not that simple," Virginia said finally. "Wes deceived me about his circumstances. I don't even know if my feelings for him were based on reality or fantasy." "Then perhaps it's time to find out," Charlotte suggested gently, "before you commit to a life that will never satisfy you." After Charlotte left, Virginia stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the rolling hills that surrounded Crossbow Ridge. Somewhere among those hills, Wes Calder was conducting business that probably involved more wealth and influence than her father had accumulated in 30 years of careful empire building. The knowledge should have made her feel foolish for pitying his apparent poverty, but instead it made her question everything she thought she understood about worth and value. The afternoon passed in a blur of final preparations for the evening's celebration. Virginia's dress, an elaborate creation of silk and lace that had cost more than most families spent on clothing, in a year hung from her wardrobe like a costume for a role she wasn't sure she wanted to play. The engagement announcement had been carefully prepared, the guest list meticulously organized, and the social machinery of Crossbow Ridge set in motion to celebrate a union that would strengthen business alliances and maintain social order. As evening approached, Virginia found herself thinking about the moment when her engagement would be announced publicly, making retreat impossible without enormous social and financial consequences. Her father had invested considerable resources in this celebration. The Whitman family had made their enthusiasm known throughout the territory, and backing out now would create scandals that could damage both families for years. But as she began the process of dressing for what might be the most important evening of her life, Virginia realized that she was preparing to make a choice that would define her entire future. Once the engagement was announced publicly, she would be committed to a path that led inevitably to marriage with Marcus, to a life of comfortable respectability, to the gradual suffocation of every passionate feeling she had discovered in herself over the past month. The alternative, following her heart toward a man who had deceived her about fundamental facts, who might not even want her now that his deception had been discovered, seemed equally impossible. Even if Wes still cared for her, even if his feelings had been genuine despite his hidden wealth, choosing him would require abandoning everything she had been raised to value. As Virginia looked at herself in the mirror, dressed in silk and diamonds, and preparing to accept a life that felt like a beautiful prison, she realized that the choice before her wasn't really between two men. It was between two versions of herself, the dutiful daughter who made practical decisions based on social expectations, and the woman who had discovered that genuine connection mattered more than security. The harvest celebration would begin in 2 hours. Her engagement would be announced before midnight. And sometime between now and then, Virginia would have to decide which version of herself she wanted to be for the rest of her life. The clock on her dressing table ticked steadily toward the moment when choice would become impossible, and Virginia found herself thinking about wooden horses, broken wagons, and the quiet voice that had asked whether wealth changed who someone really was. Perhaps it was time to find out if love could survive the discovery that everything she thought she knew had been wrong from the beginning. Perhaps it was time to discover whether she was brave enough to choose authentic feeling over social safety. The evening stretched before her like an unwritten story, and for the first time in weeks, Virginia felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. The emerald silk dress rustled with each step as Virginia descended the grand staircase of the Territorial Hotel, where Crossbow Ridge's annual harvest celebration was already in full swing. The gown had been specially ordered from San Francisco, its elaborate bustle and intricate beadwork designed to mark this evening as significant, memorable, and befitting a woman of her social position. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, Virginia felt like an actress preparing for the most important performance of her life. The hotel's main ballroom had been transformed for the occasion, with harvest decorations adorning every surface and the territory's most influential families gathered in their finest attire. Governor Hutchins and his wife commanded attention near the massive fireplace, while territorial judges, banking families, and successful merchants filled the room with the comfortable buzz of people who knew their places in the social hierarchy. Virginia scanned the crowd automatically, noting faces and calculating relationships with the precision her father had taught her. These were the people whose opinions would shape her future, whose approval would determine her family's continued prosperity, whose expectations would define the boundaries of her life. Tonight, she would formally join their ranks through engagement to Marcus Whitman, cementing her position in a world that valued predictability above all else. Marcus approached immediately, resplendent in his evening attire and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose careful plans were coming to fruition. He offered his arm with practiced gallantry, and Virginia accepted it with the smile she had perfected for social occasions, warm enough to appear genuine, distant enough to maintain proper reserve. "You look magnificent," Marcus said, his voice carrying the rehearsed sincerity of someone who had prepared for this moment extensively. "I believe this will be an evening we'll remember for the rest of our lives." Virginia murmured appropriate acknowledgement while her eyes continued scanning the crowd. Part of Hethy, part she was trying to suppress, searched for a familiar figure, for weathered hands and quiet confidence, for the possibility that Wes might have somehow appeared at this celebration. But the faces around her were all predictably familiar, all safely approved, all exactly what she should have wanted to see. Her father appeared at her elbow, his expression radiating satisfaction and relief. Edmund Hale had invested considerable social capital in this evening, using the harvest celebration to announce his daughter's engagement in the most public way possible. The gesture would strengthen business relationships, demonstrate family stability, and end speculation about Virginia's recent unconventional behavior. "The governor wants to congratulate you personally," Edmund murmured, guiding Virginia and Marcus toward the distinguished group near the fireplace. "This is exactly the sort of recognition our family needs." As they made their way through the crowd, Virginia noticed the approving glances, the satisfied nods, the sense that everything was unfolding exactly as society expected it should. She was playing her assigned role perfectly, the dutiful daughter, making a practical marriage that would benefit both families and maintain social order. But with each step toward the formal announcement, Virginia felt something inside her rebelling against the inevitable. This wasn't wrong, exactly, but it wasn't right either. She was about to commit to a life that would satisfy everyone except herself, to choose security over authenticity, to abandon the possibility of genuine connection in favor of social approval. The governor's congratulations were effusive and public, clearly intended to demonstrate his approval of the match. Other territorial officials followed suit, creating a momentum of social endorsement that would make any future retreat extremely difficult. Virginia accepted their good wishes with grace while feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. As the evening progressed toward the moment when her engagement would be formally announced, Virginia found herself remembering the morning when Wes had repaired her wagon. She had been frustrated, surrounded by useless men, offering impractical solutions, faced with a problem that required genuine competence to solve. His quiet confidence had cut through the social posturing to address the actual issue, demonstrating that substance mattered more than appearance. Now she faced a different kind of problem, the realization that she was about to marry the wrong man for the right reasons, committing to a life of comfortable dissatisfaction because it was what everyone expected. But unlike the broken wagon, this problem couldn't be solved with practical skills and straightforward action. This required courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edmund's voice rose above the crowd as he called for attention. "If I might have your indulgence for a moment, I have some wonderful news to share." The ballroom quieted as the assembled guests turned their attention toward the small platform where Edmund stood with Virginia and Marcus beside him. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the public commitment that would define her future and end any possibility of changing course. Virginia felt Marcus's hand tighten on her arm, offering support and claiming possession simultaneously. Her father beamed with satisfaction as he prepared to announce the engagement that would secure his daughter's future and strengthen his business position. The crowd waited expectantly for confirmation of what many had already suspected. "It is my great pleasure to announce the engagement of my daughter Virginia to Mr. Marcus Whitman," Edmund declared, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "The wedding will take place in the spring, uniting two families in both love and partnership." Applause erupted throughout the ballroom as Virginia felt her fate being sealed by social approval. She smiled and accepted congratulations while Marcus displayed the engagement ring to those close enough to admire its size and quality. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, exactly as society expected, exactly as her practical education had prepared her to want. But as the celebration swirled around her, Virginia realized that she felt nothing, no joy, no satisfaction, no sense of completion. She was going through the motions of happiness, while her heart remained completely detached from the proceedings. Then, through the crowd of well-wishers and the din of congratulations, Virginia heard a voice that made her blood freeze. "Congratulations, Miss Hale. I hope you'll be very happy." She turned toward the familiar voice and found herself staring into the dark eyes of Wes Calder, who stood at the edge of the crowd looking exactly as he had the day she met. Him-worn clothes, weathered hands, and the quiet confidence that had initially drawn her attention. His presence at the harvest celebration seemed impossible, given his apparent departure from Crossbow Ridge and his lack of social connections to the gathered elite. But there he was, offering polite congratulations with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, watching her commit to a life that would forever exclude the possibility of choosing him instead. The world seemed to slow as Virginia stared at Wes, her mind racing to understand how he had appeared at this celebration when she thought he was gone forever. The polite congratulations on his lips carried no warmth, and his dark eyes held a sadness that cut through her carefully constructed composure like a blade through silk. Around them, the celebration continued, but Virginia felt as if she and Wes existed in a bubble of tense silence amid the noise and revelry. Marcus's grip on her arm tightened possessively as he noticed her attention fixed on the intruder. "Virginia, who is this man? How did he gain admission to a private celebration?" Before Virginia could respond, Wes reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an elegant invitation bearing the territorial seal. "I was invited by Governor Hutchins himself, as a courtesy to my business interests in the territory, Wes Calder, owner of Riverside mining operations." The introduction sent a ripple of recognition through the nearby guests. Several territorial officials stepped forward with expressions of interest and respect, clearly familiar with the reputation and wealth associated with the Riverside claims. Virginia watched in fascination as the same people who would have dismissed Wes as a vagrant now offered him deference appropriate to his actual financial status. Marcus's face went pale as he realized he was confronting not a dismissed employee, but one of the territory's wealthiest men. "Mr. Calder, we weren't aware of your presence this evening." "I don't make a habit of announcing myself," Wes replied quietly, his gaze still fixed on Virginia. "I prefer to let my actions speak rather than my reputation." Virginia felt the weight of his words like a physical blow. Throughout their entire relationship, Wes had demonstrated his worth through competence and character, while she had judged him by appearance and social position. Now, faced with the revelation of his true status, she was forced to confront how shallow her initial assumptions had been. "Virginia," Wes said softly, "might I have a word with you privately? There are things I need to say before you commit to a future you might regret." The request sent shockwaves through the nearby guests. Edmund Hale pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Calder, this is neither the time nor the place for whatever business you think you have with my daughter." "With respect, sir, this isn't about business," Wes replied, his voice remaining calm despite the tension surrounding him. "This is about ensuring that Miss Hale makes her decision with complete information." Virginia found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "What information?" Wes removed his worn hat, the same simple hat she had watched him tip respectfully during their first encounter, and held it against his chest in a gesture that somehow managed to convey both humility and determination. "The information that I love you," he said simply, his words carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over their section of the ballroom. "Not for your family's wealth or social position, not for the business advantages you might provide, but for the woman I saw defend competence over convention, substance over appearance, truth over comfortable lies." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Virginia felt the last of her carefully constructed composure crumble. Here, in front of everyone who mattered in territorial society, Wes was offering her the choice she had convinced herself was impossible: authentic love over social safety, genuine connection over practical alliance. "Mr. Calder," Marcus stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You are causing a scene at a private celebration. I must ask you to leave immediately." "I'll leave," Wes agreed, placing his hat on Virginia's head in a gesture so simple and profound that several women in the crowd audibly sighed. "But first, I want Virginia to know that she has another choice, that love doesn't have to be a luxury she can't afford, that someone sees her worth in ways that have nothing to do with social position or family connections." Virginia reached up to touch the worn felt of his hat, feeling its weight settle over her carefully arranged hair like a crown that actually meant something. The gesture was simultaneously ridiculous and perfect, a working man's hat on a woman dressed in silk and diamonds, proclaiming that she belonged to his world rather than the elegant ballroom surrounding them. "Virginia," her father's voice cut through the moment like a knife, "remove that hat immediately. This man is causing a disgraceful scene that will be talked about for months." But Virginia found herself unable to move, paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice before her. She could remove the hat, accept Marcus's proposal, and live the life everyone expected: comfortable, respectable, and utterly without the passion she had discovered in herself. Or she could keep the hat, follow her heart, and face whatever consequences came from choosing love over security. The ballroom had fallen completely silent, with every guest focused on the drama unfolding before them. Virginia realized that whatever she decided would be witnessed by everyone who mattered in territorial society, making retreat impossible once her choice was made. "Choose what makes you happy, Virginia," Wes said quietly, his voice carrying a lifetime of patience and understanding. "Not what others expect, not what seems practical, but what your heart tells you is right." Virginia looked around the silent ballroom, seeing the faces of everyone who had shaped her understanding of worth and value, everyone who had taught her that security mattered more than satisfaction. Then she looked at Wes, whose quiet strength had challenged everything she thought she knew about measuring a man's worth. Slowly, deliberately, Virginia reached up and removed Marcus's engagement ring, placing it gently in his palm, with a smile that felt like the first genuine expression she had worn all evening. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she said clearly enough for the entire room to hear, "but I've realized that a practical marriage isn't what I want for my life." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers as Virginia turned to face her father, whose expression mixed fury with something that might have been reluctant admiration for her courage. "Father, I know this isn't what you planned, but I can't marry a man I don't love to satisfy social expectations." Edmund Hale stared at his daughter for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the strength of will that had always been present beneath her dutiful exterior. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "If you make this choice, Virginia, you'll face consequences that can't be undone. Social ostracism, financial difficulties, the loss of everything I've worked to build for you." Virginia nodded, understanding the weight of what she was choosing. "I know, Father, but I'd rather face those challenges with someone who loves me for who I am than spend my life pretending to be satisfied with safety." She turned to Wes, whose expression had shifted from resignation to cautious hope. "If your offer is still open, I'd like to take that walk we never had. To talk about wooden horses and broken wagons, and whether two people can build something real together." Wes stepped forward and offered his arm with the same quiet confidence she had admired from their first meeting. "It would be my honor, Miss Hale." As they walked toward the ballroom exit together, Virginia heard the explosion of shocked conversation behind them, but she found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she was choosing what she wanted rather than what others expected, following her heart rather than social convention. The worn hat on her head felt like the most valuable thing she had ever worn. 2 years later, Virginia Calder stood beside the new freight wagon she and Wes had designed together, watching their joint crew load supplies bound for the growing mining settlements scattered throughout the territory. The wagon bore the distinctive marks of their collaborative effort, Wes's practical engineering combined with Virginia's understanding of efficient cargo organization, creating a vehicle that could handle rough terrain while maximizing payload capacity. The morning sun cast the same golden light across Crossbow Ridge's main street that had illuminated her dramatic choice at the harvest celebration, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Virginia wore practical clothing suited for business travel rather than silk gowns, designed to impress society gatherings. Her hands showed the calluses that came from actual work, rather than the soft smoothness of privileged leisure. Most significantly, her expression carried the satisfaction of someone who had discovered authentic purpose rather than the careful composure of someone playing an assigned role. "Mrs. Calder," called Samuel Burke from his blacksmith shop, "that new axle design is holding up beautifully. Haven't seen a single failure in 6 months of heavy use." Virginia smiled and waved acknowledgement, still finding pleasure in her married name and the respect it had earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited position. The transition from Virginia Hale to Virginia Calder had required more courage than she had initially understood, but it had also brought rewards she never could have anticipated. The choice she had made at the harvest celebration had indeed carried consequences, just as her father had warned. Several prominent families had initially ostracized her for the social scandal of rejecting Marcus Whitman in favor of a man they had considered beneath her station. Business relationships had suffered when territorial officials questioned the Hale family's judgment and reliability. But other consequences had proven more positive than anyone expected. Wes's mining wealth, combined with his practical business insights and Virginia's understanding of territorial commerce, had created opportunities that dwarfed anything her father's freight company had previously achieved. Their partnership had evolved into a business empire that commanded respect throughout the territory, though it operated on principles very different from traditional commercial hierarchies. Ready for the Northern Circuit, Wes emerged from their office, carrying the detailed route plans that had become their signature approach to territorial supply chains. His appearance had changed little over 2 years. She still wore practical clothes and maintained the same quiet confidence, but now his status as Virginia's husband and business partner was universally recognized and respected. All loaded and checked, Virginia replied, consulting the manifest they had developed together. We should reach Pine Creek by evening, Miller's Ridge by tomorrow afternoon, and the new copper camp by Thursday. Their travel routine had become both professional collaboration and extended courtship, allowing them to explore the territory together while building something substantial through combined effort. Virginia had discovered that working alongside someone she loved transformed labor from obligation into joy, making even difficult journeys feel like adventures shared rather than burdens endured. "Mrs. Calder?" A small voice called from beside the wagon. Virginia looked down to see young Timothy Burke, Samuel's grandson, holding a carefully carved wooden deer that showed the same patient craftsmanship as the horse Wes had made for him 2 years earlier. "What do you think?" Timothy asked proudly. "Mr. Wes has been teaching me carving on Sunday afternoons." Virginia knelt to examine the boy's work, noting the steady improvement in his technique and the obvious pride he took in creating something beautiful with his own hands. "It's wonderful, Timothy. You're becoming quite skilled." As she stood, Virginia caught Wes watching the interaction with the gentle smile that never failed to remind her why she had chosen him over social safety. His patience with children, his willingness to share skills without expecting recognition, his quiet generosity toward anyone who showed genuine interest in learning these qualities had attracted her initially and continued to deepen her love as their marriage matured. "Time to go," Wes said, helping Virginia onto the wagon seat with the same courteous attention he had shown during their first business meeting. "We want to reach Pine Creek while there's still daylight for unloading." As their wagon rolled smoothly through Crossbow Ridge's familiar streets, Virginia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The choice she had made at the harvest celebration had required abandoning everything she thought she wanted in favor of everything she actually needed. The transition had been difficult, requiring her to learn new skills, develop different relationships, and discover strengths she never knew she possessed. But it had also revealed possibilities she never could have imagined from within the constraints of her privileged upbringing. Working as an equal partner with Wes had shown her capabilities she never knew she possessed and satisfactions that no amount of social approval could have provided. "Virginia," Wes said as they reached the edge of town, "I have something for you." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by careful craftsmanship and detailed with delicate carvings. Inside, nestled in soft fabric, lay a pair of simple gold wedding bands, not the elaborate jewelry of her former life, but rings that spoke of enduring commitment rather than social display. "For our second anniversary next month," Wes explained, "I thought we should mark the occasion properly." Virginia picked up one of the rings, noting how its simple elegance perfectly represented their partnership, substantial without being ostentatious, beautiful without being extravagant, designed to last rather than to impress. It was exactly what she would have chosen if she had known what truly mattered when they first married. "They're perfect," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger, beside the simple band Wes had given her during their quiet wedding ceremony 2 years earlier. "Just like everything else about this life we've built together." As their wagon rolled north toward the mining settlements that had become their primary territory, Virginia thought about the woman she had been before that morning when her wagon broke down and changed everything. That woman had measured worth by social position, had valued security over satisfaction, had assumed that practical choices must necessarily exclude passionate feelings. The woman she had become understood that true wealth came from work that mattered, relationships that nurtured growth, and the courage to choose authenticity over appearance. She had traded the comfortable prison of social expectations for the challenging freedom of building something real with someone who saw her true worth. "Look ahead," Wes said, pointing toward the mountain trail that wound through pine forests toward their destination. "Still beautiful country, no matter how many times we travel it." Virginia followed his gaze, seeing the landscape they had explored together over dozens of journeys, territory that had become as familiar as the rooms of their modest home, but never lost its capacity to surprise and delight them. Like their marriage, the land revealed new possibilities to those patient enough to look carefully and brave enough to venture beyond established paths. The most beautiful, she agreed, settling back against the wagon seat with the contentment of someone who had discovered that the best destinations were often reached by roads no one else thought to travel. Behind them, Crossbow Ridge continued its familiar routines, but ahead lay adventures yet to be discovered, challenges yet to be met, and possibilities yet to be explored. Virginia had learned that real security came not from avoiding risk, but from facing uncertainty with someone whose strength complemented her own, whose values matched her deepest convictions, whose love had taught her that worth was measured not by what others thought, but by what she and Wes could build together. The wagon rolled smoothly toward the mountains, carrying supplies for communities that depended on their reliable service and bearing two people who had discovered that sometimes the most practical choice was to follow your heart. The wooden wheels turned steadily, just as they had on that morning when everything changed. But now they carried Virginia toward a future she had chosen, rather than one that had been chosen for her. And that, she reflected, as the familiar landscape unfolded before them, made all the difference in the world.